Sweet. All right. Thanks all for coming to another one of these here history lesson thingies. So the very loose theme of this this one is trans folk, but really as I was compiling it, it's just sort of like interesting people from the past who had interesting gender identities that I was rarely able to cover under the header of Rejected Princesses, even though a lot of people would write in and ask for me to cover them. So chief among those, in terms of like people I was asked to cover that I just did not feel fit the project at all, was a person named Charley Parkhurst, 1812 to 1879, American, mostly in California. Stagecoach driver, had one eye, normally wore a eye patch. I don't think that there's any pictures of him anywhere, any photos at least. And was generally considered to be just like an amazing stagecoach driver. And this is not like easy stagecoach driving. I mean, this is like tight passes through mountains, lots of rattlesnakes, you know, frozen streams, bears, Native Americans raiding. It was a bad time, but very safe. There were a lot of these stagecoach drivers who would show up who were kind of daredevils and would do whatever the heck they wanted. And a lot of people who were kind of adrenaline junkies, but One-Eyed Charley was, as he was known, was pretty safe. Managed to always get the cargo where it needed to be. Drove for Wells Fargo. Mostly did routes between large cities like SF and smaller gold outposts like Bodie, California. Drank a lot of whiskey. And ended up living, I think, about 65 years. Died of tongue cancer, which I wasn't clear was a thing. And then when Charley Parkhurst died, it was discovered that Charley was trans and that Charley's birth name was Charlotte. At which point, a bunch of people all across the U.S. Started trying to uncover what this is a crazy story. I gotta report this to the press. Again, this is like 1879 that Charley died, so attitudes were what they were. But the press discovered that Charley was abandoned by his parents and they were born in New Hampshire, ended up in an orphanage, and had a job cleaning out horse stables at that orphanage, at which point he made a mentor named Ebenezer Balch, which is quite a name. It sounds very Charles Dickens-y. I don't know why we don't name more kids Ebenezer nowadays. Got a hang for horses at that point. Moved to SF by way of Panama, of all places. Just sort of wandered around the North America for a bit. Central America, began doing the stagecoach driving for Wells Fargo as well as other companies, and did that for a while until 1860s when the railroads started coming in and really the stagecoach work started drying up. Did a couple odd jobs after that, opened up a saloon, worked as a lumberjack, and ended up actually dying pretty wealthy, which is fairly rare for stagecoach drivers. Even registered to vote, and according to some historians, this makes Charley Parkhurst has been credited as the first woman to vote in the U.S. I don't think Charley would have viewed himself as a woman. Obviously, kept it a secret, so it's maybe the first trans man to vote in the U.S. But even that is like, well, did you survey everyone? But regardless, voted 50 years ahead of the time that the gender that Charley was assigned at birth was allowed to vote. So that is a distinction, and generally well liked by everyone who knew him. It's pretty cool. Going off of the stagecoach drivers, because there's a lot of really interesting characters who showed up doing stagecoach driving. This is just a thing to do. It's kind of cool upwards mobility for certain sectors of society. I covered one in my first book. If y'all haven't read it, I'll just cover the story. This is Stagecoach Mary Fields. Worked in Cascade, Montana. Was 6'2". That's an actual picture of her. Worked into her 50s or 60s as a stagecoach driver, but Just was this incredibly colorful character, very Wild West, known for like smoking cigars, bar brawls, fighting off wolves, packing a pistol everywhere she went. Actually got a legal exception to allow her to drink in saloons. And she has a great dog, it's true. She there was a kid in one of the cities she lived. I think this was actually Cascade, Montana, who did a book report, kind of like a report for school on her, in which, and this is a quote, described her as she drinks whiskey and she swears and she is a Republican, which makes her a low, foul creature, which is a quote that just kills me. She, among her many jobs, she was a foreman for construction of a mission, and her status as such actually rankled some of the other people who were there building. So she like dealt with these conflicts by punching people in the teeth, which didn't actually help anything. She got into a lot of duels with other people on the construction sites, and ended up being let go. As it, there's a legend that the abbot or the person in charge of this mission kept finding bullet holes in their laundry and was just like, "You gotta go, Mary. This is just not working out." Other odd jobs she did. She mostly did the stagecoach driving, but at one point she set up a restaurant, she had a laundromat, and she was generally kind to a fault. Like her restaurant ostensibly kind of fell on hard times because she would just let people eat for free because she was a soft touch. She wasn't always a soft touch if someone was a jerk, though. For her laundromat, apparently some dude owed her $2 and refused to pay, so she punched out his lights in broad daylight and declared his laundry bill paid. She was also a champion babysitter. She loved kids, even though she, like, people were a little hesitant to entrust them to her. But she loved them and they loved her back. And yeah, it's kind of amazing. But best known as a postal carrier, she and the routes she did were treacherous. Like Montana, the points would sometimes get at worst like 45 degrees below zero. She would tell stories about how she actually had to pace all night, sometimes just keep alive. Like her stagecoach would get stuck in the snow and wouldn't be able to make it all the way to town, and so she'd just have to pace all night to just keep awake. Otherwise, she wouldn't wake back up. There were times where she would actually tell stories where she had to like walk 10 miles in the snow, except she actually had evidence of this where she was actually carrying one of these giant bags of mail with her. But yeah, also big fan of the local baseball team, grew bouquets for any player who made home runs. Just a generally colorful character that everybody loved. The actor Gary Cooper, who was a pretty well-known actor back in the day, did a great eulogy for her, where he described her as quote, one of the freest souls to ever draw a breath or a 38. This was a quote that he apparently loved because he kept making it in various magazines. He wrote about her in I don't even know how many magazines, and they were all subtly different. I went down and tracked down a bunch of these different articles because I just like, oh, it's syndicated. No, this dude Gary Cooper is like, again, like a big name actor back in the day, just loved Stagecoach Mary and ended up writing about her like over and over and over again. And she's never gotten her own movie, which I think is just a shame. I don't know who I'd say should play her, but man, there needs to be like more movies about 6'2" black postal workers from the 1800s. Anyways, moving right along. Continuing on with the general theme of like interesting trans folk that I'd never be able to write about for Ridiculous Princess. This is one that I got asked about to do constantly. This is actually one of the more famous trans figures in history. This is James Barry, seen here on the left. James Barry was an inspector general in the British Army, assigned female at birth. Was known, his birth name was Margaret Ann Bulky, is born in Ireland. Very early on kind of abandoned that that identity after he moved to London. He met his uncle, who was actually, his uncle had actually the birth name of James Barry, and his uncle was a painter, but died when James, named Margaret, was 16 or 17. Willed a bunch of money, was fairly well off, and so Margaret took James's name and identity, essentially. And 3 years after the original James Barry had died, reappeared and wearing a trench coat, 3-inch inserts, and moved to Edinburgh for med school. And a lot of people suspected that this James Barry was not on the level, but they didn't suspect it was a gender thing. They just thought that James Barry was too young and his skin was like too soft. It also didn't really match up with like the age of the James Barry that had died. But James Barry kept with it throughout all of med school, ended up being really good at it, and kind of weathered all of the suspicion and the insults. Ended up having to get like a friend of the family. I'm not entirely sure what the relationship is here, as a person named Lord Erskine to intervene to allow them to take the exam to become a doctor, but passed with flying colors, and afterwards enlisted in the British Army as an assistant surgeon. 1813, moved up the ranks pretty quickly, went to South Africa, and stayed there for about 10 years on post, and befriended the local governor there, a man named Charles Somerset. But rumors started swirling that the two were involved with one another. But what they were being accused of was sodomy. They're buggering each other, and it actually got to be such a problem that there was an investigation done, but no result. They were let scot-free, so it was just considered, just weird rumor that was swirling around. And afterwards, it is generally suspected to sort of take away from any suspicion of like to get people off of his case. James Barry started demonstrating a really hot temper and just yelling at people all the time. It was like, I'm a hot-tempered dude, and this is what dudes do, is they yell at each other and they hit each other and they throw medicine bottles at each other, which he did. Was actually on record with Florence Nightingale wrote about this dude and just was like, this guy's an asshole, he keeps yelling at me. Wouldn't get engaged in duels. Like there's multiple instances of James Barry after like the first brush with danger, just like being so hot tempered that he was getting into duels, which I think is amazing. But regardless of all the hot-headedness, was also just a very skilled surgeon, and is apparently the first on record to perform a cesarean where both the mom and the child survived, which is honestly quite the distinction. Really into social reform too, along the lines of what Florence Nightingale was advocating for. Was a lot of like sanitation, cleanliness. This was not a thing that was particularly well regarded in those days, but also just into like prison reform, asylum reform, just generally like things are not clean and like need to do better. So advocated for a whole lot of stuff. So spent 10, maybe 15 years in South Africa, then moved to Mauritius, which is a small island off the coast of Africa, kind of near Madagascar. Butted heads with another army surgeon, dueled, got court-martialed, and then let off scot-free, found not guilty. Just kept butting heads with people. And this just kept rising up the ranks higher and higher and higher until by 1857, he was inspector general in charge of like all of Britain's military hospitals, like pretty much about as high, I think, to my understanding of the British Army at that point, about as high as he could raise, which I think is just amazing. Died in 1865 of dysentery, apparently played too much Oregon Trail, and died. His will was that he would be buried in his clothes uninspected, because he had worn this overcoat all the time, no matter what the weather. Just don't inspect. His wishes were not followed through, which sucks. And so the person who inspected his body was just like, oh my God, this is not what I was expecting. News leaked, but to the credit of the major who was in charge of the army, he went on record as like, whatever gender James Barry viewed themselves as or what they were as birth was, quote, none of my business, don't give a fuck. So yeah, that was the story of James Barry. Unfortunately, it's sort of understood even to modern day. There's a person who I think last year announced on Twitter that they were writing a historical novel about James Barry. It was like this woman who like hoodwinked everybody and like managed to do all this stuff. and just Twitter dragged this author as like, no, that's not a woman, that was a trans man. How dare you misgender? Like, this is an incredibly clear-cut case. Like, it is rare that enough historical evidence comes down that you end up being able to say pretty definitively, oh yeah, no, that person definitely, like, with modern gender understanding, would allow themselves to be seen in such a way, like it would have that modern gender understanding. But it's pretty clear, like, no, that's absolutely what kind of happened here. So yeah, James Barry, kind of amazing. And then to wrap it up, this has been a pretty crazy week, so I've not had as much that I can share with you. This is actually going to be a short one, but is really kind of an amazing one, because this goes back farther than any of the other ones that I've talked about. This actually goes back to the 1500s in the Spanish Inquisition. This is a person known variously as Elena and Elena de Cespedes. And real quick, the illustration here, and actually how I learned about this human was by a person named Ria Brodell, who did a project, I believe it's called the Butch History. This is an illustration from it. They did a book that was published a couple years ago. Highly recommend going and checking it out. Anyways, so this is a person who is a black freed slave in Spain, became a doctor, and judging off of what went on, was likely intersex. So here's the story of Elena slash, oh, this is Cespedes. It's a person who worked variously as these are not necessarily terms that I'm entirely familiar with what they mean. A hosier, I don't know what that means. A soldier, a licensed surgeon, a lot of different jobs. And at one point early in their lives had a husband and identified as a woman, gave birth to a son, and then said that they grew a penis while giving birth to the son. This was something that it was basically the people who were handling the medical folk who were handling the birth were like, wait, what's going on here? And brought in magistrates because they were so freaked out about it. And then, so it's thought that this person was like, just came up with I don't know what happened. It happened while I was giving birth. I don't know. Lady parts, they're mysterious. Who knows? Waka waka. Ended up like living both at various points in their life as a man and as a woman. Had affairs with women while identifying as a man. Actually became engaged to one, a woman named Maria del Cano. And in the lead up, because Elena slash O had kind of a weird history, is like, okay, well, I guess it's a man, but gave birth, I don't, what? Lead up, people investigated this person, people who, of course, of good repute, who did some investigation. It's unclear, the historical records are not clear as to what said investigation was, but came away saying, oh yeah, no, that's a dude. That's totally a dude. I don't know why anybody would say it was a lady. And so actually got married to this woman, Maria del Cano. I don't know what happened to the earlier relationship. I really wish I did. But it really, like, this is how the story goes. It just sort of jumps. So gets married to Maria del Cano, then gets arrested a couple years in when one of the nosy neighbors starts gossiping, like goes to the authorities and says that they're engaging in sodomy. And so brought up on charges of sodomy, of sorcery, and of disrespect to the institution of marriage, which was actually apparently like a thing you could get charged with back in the day. When they testified as saying that they were, quote, hermaphrodite, and that they had committed no wrong, and that if they look now, they had no male genitalia, they had no penis because it had fallen off by a serious accident. Again, kind of like, what? But this, okay. The trial, which was not exactly open-minded people, but very confused people, found Elena to be Elena, found this person to be a woman, charged them with bigamy, saying that they didn't annul the previous marriage where they'd had a kid. So charged with bigamy, fakery, which apparently was a thing you could be charged with. That was a crime back in the day. Perjury and mockery of marriage, which is a thing. It's disrespect of marriage. That was breaking the law. They were found to have 200 lashes and served 10 years in a public hospital as a doctor, but had to dress as a woman. The whole thing is very confusing. Like, I wish that I had more information to share with you, but this is a person that really existed, that like is the first intersex freed slave Black surgeon. Like, it's so many firsts in history that I've ever heard of. Just an incredibly fascinating character that the people of the times had no idea what to do with. I wish that I'd been able to include them as something with Rejected Princesses, but God only knows, like how to, like, yeah, how they would have wanted themselves portrayed at any given point in their lives. So I didn't feel right, like, including them under. But it's such a fascinating story. I really hope that other documents rise up from nowhere to shine more light on it. But given that this is the 1500s, it seems a little unlikely. But anyways, that's what I got for you for this week. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed. I did.